Greetings for lecture number 8. We're going to be discussing sections 3.1 to 3.2 in minority studies. And one of the things that we start off with is the concept of stratification or layers. We in sociology love making up new words and using them, I guess, to make ourselves feel important. But we use the term stratification to talk about how society is often layered, with groups on top and groups below. And again, this is done through the exercise of power. There's nothing natural or biological about groups pushing one group down to maintain their superiority. So then in, again, section 3.1 of minority studies, we talk about race and ethnicity again. Again, race is this classification, including people that were at different times declared white or not. That this is this belabored, biologically flawed concept of race, that somehow it has something to do with biology. Ethnicity is our better term, and that's again coming from the culture that you're raised in, because it doesn't really matter about your genome. If you're raised in Norway, chances are you're going to speak Norwegian. We talk about prejudice and discrimination. Again, prejudice is a feeling, an action, a set of assumptions, a way of thinking about another group. And discrimination is an action where you're actively discriminating. The book talks about de jure discrimination, that which is held in the law, and de facto, or cultural discrimination. Then it discusses assimilation. And again, they talk about two different kinds: cultural assimilations, values and beliefs. And then structural assimilation: are you able to work, live, be around the dominant group, or are you held to be separate and segregated? Now, the book throws out a term that is a terrible term, journalistic term, melting pot. And it kind of surprises me that they put that term in this book. The fact is that we don't find any evidence of a melting pot. A melting pot would be, 30% of the population is, let's say, German, then we would have 30% of the language be German, 30% of the holidays be German, but we don't find that. What we find is what we call Anglo-conformity, that each group, Irish, Italian, German, Jewish, Chinese, come to America and they're forced to Anglo-conform. And that word should be in your book, but isn't, so I want you to write it down, Anglo-conformity. Talked about immigration and the next idea there. And again, here we want to emphasize the idea, all these groups, every group of immigrant, whatever group you're from, were hated. The Irish were hated. That's my background. Germans were hated. Italians, Sicilians, Eastern Europeans, Chinese, Japanese. Each new group was hated. And that's one of the patterns I want you to see in this discussion as you read all the different group stories. Again, we read about W.E.B. Du Bois. Special notice for Sally Hemings. Definitely put a star by that one. Definitely going to be some questions about Sally Hemings. After the Civil War, we see the Klan and other anti-immigration groups flourishing for the next 70 years. And it's very reminiscent of maybe what we're seeing now, where the problems of a declining economy in the country are blamed on immigrant groups. So we also want to talk about some specific instances. The James Byrd lynching in Jasper, Texas. That I want you to remember because while it doesn't discuss the date, this was not back in the 1950s or 1960s. This happened in fairly recent times, where in Jasper, Texas, a man was drugged to death behind a truck by two white men. Couple of dates and things to remember. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. 1865, the 13th Amendment passes abolishing slavery. 1868, the 14th Amendment is passed, demanding equal rights and saying there's equal rights. And in 1870, we have the 15th Amendment and the voting rights supposedly secured, and there's a lot of debate about that. What's the point of reading all of these different groups at the same time in this chapter about African Americans? Because what I want you to see is that what happens to African Americans and other different groups, that there's a pattern. That there's a pattern of a dominant group in America, white, starting with English, Anglo, Europeans, using violence, using power to basically dominate another group and make them subordinate. The secret word for this lecture is W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois. So make sure that you write that down. This is for lecture 8. Now I want to take a special section here because there's a part in your thing about the Wilmington Massacre. I want to talk about it, obviously, what's in the video you're responsible for, but I want to go into it a little bit depth here. So the Wilmington, North Carolina Massacre is 1898. What happens? White supremacists, Southern Democrats of the time, overthrow the elected biracial city government. Blacks and whites were serving, and white supremacists chase them out of town, burn black businesses, kill anywhere between 14 and 60 people, depending on the things that were written at the time and people's stories. Why did it happen? Well, you had white resentment over the fact that blacks were beginning to become fairly prosperous. We see a callback to this in 1921's Tulsa Massacre. And blacks were made a scapegoat, particularly for white lower class folks, that the reason they weren't getting ahead was because of black folks. How did this happen? A bunch of speeches were made, particularly by a guy named Alfred Waddell, Waddell. He makes these speeches and inflames the white folks and right before the elections. And this happens in the white newspaper too, where whites are beginning to see black folks as the enemy and something that needs to be handled and a threat to the white superiority. Black folks in the town, because the urban area of Wilmington at this time was actually a large percentage of African Americans, they refused guns. And the white supremacist paper goes on a tirade about how that they're a threat. On November 10th, 500 white men go to the armory. They get rifles and a Gatling gun, the precursor of a machine gun, burn the black paper down, burn black businesses, attack a black neighborhood as this group of 500 white men swell to a 2,000. At gunpoint, they make the mayor resign and the chief of police resign. Waddell is declared mayor. The Wilmington Light Infantry, which would be, I guess, akin to the National Guard, is sent by the governor. But basically, what they do is they put the few remaining black people and white sympathizers on a train at gunpoint that Alfred Waddell had listed and ship them out. White papers at the time declared this a victory in North Carolina. And blame blacks for what happened. No help is offered by the state government or the federal government. The long-term effect of this was that it changed the city's demographic to a majority white and showed the state's power structure that for another 75 years, blacks would be fearful to demonstrate their rights because nothing ever happened. There were no repercussions for the white elites that were at the heart of this riot, massacre, and conspiracy. And again, that's the basis of white power when we talk about white supremacy. That's what we're talking about. White people at this time can do these things and face no repercussions. There is nothing that's going to happen to them. The guy runs people out on a rail, kills people, uses a Gatling gun, causes a riot, and gets to stay as mayor and then is reelected to being mayor. So, lots of information in lectures 7A and 7B. Some information in this lecture, lecture 8. And you may be wondering, how do I organize all of this? How do I think about all of this stuff that I'm being sort of confronted with? Well, one of the ways that we'd like you to be able to reason and use as a tool, whether you believe it or not in the long term or not, being able to use as a tool is, again, critical theory, race and ethnic theory that shows the power dynamic in a society, even critical race theory, which shows how an institution can become basically wound up with a racist inception, and then that's hard to get away from. So I want to actually just talk for a second, as an example, about the New York Police Department. So one of the oldest in the country, but let's go all the way back to the beginning. It's 1820s, and basically there's an informal system of what were called constables. They didn't receive a real salary. They were often just like the toughest people in the neighborhood became constables, and then what they would do is they often had a, if you will, a side hustle, and sometimes it was, retrieving stolen articles or being in on organized crime at the time. But one of the things they did was kidnapping. Constables in New York were responsible for kidnapping free blacks and enforcing later the Fugitive Slave Accords, where somebody would say, hey, I'm from Virginia. Here's this basic physical description of my runaway slave. And then these constables would grab often free black people in New York where they thought they were safe and forcibly take them and sell them as a bounty. This is part of the inception. You see the same thing with sheriffs, particularly in the South, were often, that system was developed to stop runaway slaves and to catch runaway slaves. So the point is that you see a system built on targeting black people and is seen as being at times racially motivated, such that now, today, 2025, the New York Police Department is a majority minority officers, black and Hispanic, Asian. It's the largest such force in the world, the largest police force in the world. But what African Americans and Hispanics, Asians in New York have pointed out is, despite having black and Hispanic and Asian officers, we still see the system, the police system, operating in a similar kind of way in which the interest of the powerful, mainly white folks, are being protected, and black, Hispanic, poor people are being targeted for policing. And this kind of policing is, like we saw with when we were talking about gay and lesbian folks, that it was this idea of we're going to enforce sexual codes and sexual versions of morality. And in this case, we're going to enforce the idea that black people need to, watch out and stay in their place and be held by this system to a subservient status. So that is Lecture 8.